Japanese folktales are abundant in number and rich in detail. Every province and many a town in the island nation tells its own stories of forest creatures, of nightly voices from the shadows, of protective spirits, and of heroes slaying great beasts and monks exorcising terrible ghosts. The supernatural beings from these legends are often collectively referred to as yokai, literally bewitching specter, and their stories range from the whimsical to the brutal to the spiritual. Japan also has a long and micromanaged history in relation to prostitution and the sale and sexual slavery of young women and some men. Since it is the nature of yokai to tend to arise wherever there are negative human emotions or intentions, ranging from mischief to murderous bloodlust to heartbreak, it is no surprise that stories of ghost sightings and supernatural phenomenon arose specifically for life within the red light district. In addition, Japan harbors a tradition of fairy tales as thinly veiled commentary on contemporary society. The format of the ghost story book, enabling artistic and satirical freedom, which under various censorship regimes would have not been allowed to appear as political writing. It's from this perspective that we will look at yokai today to learn what specters haunt the red light district and what their tales might tell us about the society and the people who created them. Japanese folklore, like the fables of many cultures, of course includes various femme fatale creatures who use their power of seduction to weaken and destroy men, even allegedly bringing about the downfall of whole nations by turning fierce leaders into feeble-minded lovers. Many such larger and smaller historical occurrences in the Japanese context are attributed to the doings of shape-shifting animals, usually kitsune, foxes, bakeneko, cats, or juguromu, spiders, who upon turning very ancient gain magical powers and the ability to transform into beautiful young women. Some are said to turn into prostituted women who entice young men to follow them into houses, where instead of gaining sexual access, the male victims are devoured and their bones spit out onto the floor. But beyond these tales, comparable to similar tales from other cultures, there are some yokai stories that transcend this simple pattern of the flesh-eating, man-crushing femme fatale and reveal a deeper understanding of the women's lived reality. There is an unsourced claim going around the internet, often accompanying articles and posts on prostitution in Japan and related yokai, namely that women in Japanese prostitution had an average life expectancy of 23 years. It is to be noted that life expectancy was low all around for the majority of people in much of the world for millennia, but it was especially low for women in prostitution, frequently sold to brothels as children, and first sold to be raped by men as minors, frequently living in lifelong debt bondage, being literally owned by pimps, with little legal recourse for any violence and abuse inflicted. With limited access to health care, contraceptives, and protection, many simply succumbed to injury or illness before reaching even middle age. When women in prostitution died, they were frequently mass cremated rather than buried. These images you see show real scenes of prostitution. Lineups of this kind, where women were presented literally in cages for men to choose from, were a normal part of legal brothels. This practice was outlawed in 1916, although women in prostitution in Japan today are still sometimes sold in a very similar fashion. All of this evidenced how prostitute women in Japanese society weren't even considered second-class citizens. They weren't considered citizens at all. Instead, they were classed as hinin, non-humans, alongside professions that dealt with animal matter, blood or death, such as butchers, tanners, and gravediggers. Furthermore, like other hinin, women in prostitution were frequently confined to quarters in specific parts of town and strictly forbidden from entering others, lest they besmirch the ordinary citizen or their good Buddhist ways. This confinement presented a severe fire hazard, considering that the wooden Japanese cities of old frequently burned down, meaning that in case of fire, red light district populations would have real trouble getting to safety. Sometimes, women themselves set fires to attempt an escape from their brothels, but if caught, risked severe violent punishment. If their escape was successful, pimps threatened their families, who had to pay back the sum the woman had originally been sold for, plus interest, unless they could find her and bring her back. Needless to say, non-prostitute women were forbidden from entering red light districts, just as they are in many places today. Nonetheless, prostitution was systematically taxed because governments rarely have shied away from making money, even when branding women as dirty and sinful. And regulated, most notably by a complex ranking system, by which some women were elevated over others, to give each woman some semblance of status to strive for or maintain, and someone below her to look down upon. Add to this the daily economic competition, effectively undermining large-scale female solidarity. Women higher up in the hierarchy of prostitutes were able to attain a partial education, but it too ultimately served to provide better entertainment for men, and was not invested in to enable her to earn money in other ways, but rather to generate more profit for her pimp. While most women depicted in the famous ukiyo-e woodcuts of the 17,000s and 18,000s were so-called oiran, meaning higher-class courtesans, there was of course street-level prostitution as well, with little superficial glamour to show. And even an oiran could not refuse a man if her pimp requested that she accept him. Furthermore, the state itself became a pimp when it punished women sentenced for infidelity, sex outside marriage, or prostitution for their own profit, by sending them into closed-off red-light districts and forcing them into brothels. It is not hard to imagine that a class of people labeled and treated as non-human would come to be associated with monsters, ghosts, and the general ghastly and otherworldly. For context's sake, it's important to mention that just like with other traditions, for example the Brothers Grimm tales from Germany, collectors of folktales would pick a regional variety of a story over another, edit stories, and even invent and add their own to later become national fairytale canon. The stories to be highlighted here are most fondly remembered committed to paper by one 18th century artist of the pen name Toriyama Seikien. His illustrated bestiaries went on to inspire many future reiterations, so it is possible that these creatures too, rather than being part of a long-standing ancient tradition, were created by him as a response to the realities witnessed in his lifetime. Tracking precise times of origin for folklore is notoriously hard, and thus some mystery will remain as to the authorship of these tales. Whether women had an active hand in shaping the narratives is unclear from the very limited English-language literature available on the subject. Surely it is possible that some of these stories arose from the superstitions developed among women in prostitution and as an avenue of expressing pain, as many of them had to watch women around them die premature deaths before they did. What we do know is that some powerful men in the Tokugawa or Edo period, 1603 to 1868, critiqued the sexual enslavement of women. As one samurai wrote in 1816, "It is not easy to sell a child, and it is a fearful thing to send her to hell for life." In distant provinces and in remote regions where people grow up with constant shortages and live together in hardship, what must it be like to sell a beloved child raised at your bosom to a faraway place you've never seen, and for parents and child to never see one another again? Kosode no te. Many Japanese folklore stories deal with tsukumogami, anthropomorphized household objects that come to life due to neglect by their owners, such as a lute that hasn't been played for years or a pair of shoes in dire need of repair, or due to strong emotional attachment to an item by a recently deceased person. This is how you end up with a packet of love letters coming to life. Often, a tsukumogami will simply play pranks or merely frighten its owner or onlookers, but others have a more sinister nature, carrying the spirit of a desperate or vengeful dead person who will go on to injure or even kill. One such item are the kosode no te, short-sleeved kimono hands. Kimonos of dead women coming to life and sprouting arms and hands from their sleeves that grab onto people within their reach to fulfill what the given woman couldn't accomplish within her lifetime. A recurring motif behind the kosode no te is the prostituted woman who has died in debt bondage, but whose restless spirit returns to grab onto passers-by to beg them for money, in hopes of finally buying a freedom she never enjoyed in her lifetime. Additionally, a prostituted woman's spirit is likely to return to earth pleading for proper Buddhist burial rites that were often denied to people classed as hinin. This is potential evidence that artisans and poets, many of them frequenters of brothels themselves, knew quite intimately how desperately women in prostitution wanted to escape, how much they were under pimp control, how many of them passed before achieving freedom, and were denied basic dignity even in death. A side note on prostitution and burial rites in Japan, a female family member of mine who spent many years in Japan immersed in the culture shared with me that according to her Japanese friends, it was common for men to make detours to brothels and to buy women after a funeral to assure themselves of their vitality and virility. Keijoro. Another unfortunate supernatural encounter a man might find himself in within the Japanese red light district is coming face to face with a keijoro, hairy prostitute. This yokai looks like a normal woman with long black hair from behind, but upon turning around, one finds that this hair covers the place where her face should be. According to some descriptions, she is extremely hairy on all parts of her body. In some versions of this tale, men who see this beastly sight freeze up while the keijoro approaches, using her razor-sharp hair to slice up her victim, finally devouring him. In other versions, the keijoro might be jarring but essentially harmless, constituting more of a tragic figure. As many women were literally enslaved by brothel owners, one way they could potentially gain a little control over their bodies was to make themselves purposefully physically unattractive. through neglecting themselves, shaving off their hair, getting tattoos, or using other forms of self-harm. Some women also practiced this when they fell in love with someone and desired to no longer be sexually available to anyone else. Thus, some scholars have argued the keijiro stands symbolically for the prostituted woman who in her desperation has let her good looks go, in this way akin to a monster in the eyes of a John. Kira Kira Onna. The most potent example from within Japanese folklore for revealing the frequently deadly reality of prostitution for women is probably the Kira Kira Onna, laughing woman. In some versions of her tale, this yokai is the spirit of a prostitute woman who has passed away from illness, neglect, maltreatment, and/or violence at the hands of pimps and buyers, and who has returned to haunt the men responsible for a premature demise. Interestingly, she's not a tragic young beauty, but a middle-aged woman with a wrinkled and haunted face, gigantic in size, peering over walls or roofs at a terrified man standing below. She never physically harms the men, but cackles and laughs without end, which certainly frightens and can even drive some men insane. Interestingly enough, the Kira Kira Onna has been less frequently sexualized in her modern reiterations, perhaps due to being middle-aged rather than young and conventionally beautiful. She appears simply as a cartoonish demon with a big mouth, there to laugh at her victims, but not to seek any kind of specific vengeance or demand sociocultural introspection. The world of olden days Japan carried many unknown dangers. For travelers on unfamiliar roads taking them through unknown towns. For innkeepers having strangers passing through their doors every night, or for any citizen in times of famine and war. Thus, stories of wild animals and outsiders revealing themselves to be monsters are not surprising. Yet many vengeful ghosts and frightening supernatural apparitions are of a different and more personal nature. These are the tales of children, old people, and women who were victims of male violence or neglect, returning and taking vengeance on their tormentors, at the very least by continually reminding them of their crimes. In Japanese folklore, women feature routinely as untrustworthy seductresses, but some stories go deeper than this and potentially reveal the guilty conscience of the poet or artist, as he gives some expression to female-specific suffering. As many forms of art underlay strict censorship in much of Japan's history, and tales of yokai specifically were used as an indirect critique of society, it is also possible that rather than expressing personal guilt, artists like Toriyama were pointing out what could have been perceived as moral decay, injustice, and social ill. Also of note is the factor at play that these works were published in order to make a living and attain fame for their creator, meaning that Toriyama may not have been attempting to give his stories profound meaning either way, but rather just aimed to entertain. A less favorable and less optimistic but necessary contention here is that Toriyama Seikien and those who later utilized his inventions may have occasionally portrayed prostitute women's reality, but this does not infer that they disapproved of prostitution as an institution. Just because a given man is familiar with female suffering, as countless men have been throughout the centuries, often since they were the cause of said suffering, this doesn't mean they are definitely empathizing or that they can't believe that this, after all, is the way of the world and a necessary evil. The tightly regulated way, as well as the sheer size of the ancient and modern prostitution industry in Japan, suggests that culturally speaking, Japanese men are very comfortable with this status quo. While many of them will come face to face with evidence of human misery while utilizing or watching their peers utilize this trade, they don't seem to feel personally responsible. One silver lining to be shared near the end here is the fact that if a woman survived the many hardships of prostitution and successfully paid off her debt, she could start over and be reintegrated and accepted in society. She could earn money as a waitress, a peddler, or a merchant, get married, or enter a nunnery or convent if she chose to. Ultimately, the stories of these prostitution-inspired yokai, like many female characters and lore from around the world, aren't owned by a company or individual artist, and thus free for a reinterpretation by anyone who finds inspiration or meaning in them. Women authors, and feminist authors in particular, have often recycled flat or evil female characters into ambiguous three-dimensional ones. So here are 3 more for the collective imagination. Let me know if and how these stories speak to you. Thank you for watching. A little bonus part. There is no such thing as a John monster that came out of Japanese folklore, although it can be noted that there are humanoid yokai who buy access to women just as human men do. One prominent patron of the red light district from Japan is Nurarihyun, the slippery gourd. This yokai, in its modern reiteration, is the leader of all Japanese supernatural creatures, and is theorized to have originated as a visual pun on catfish, or in other versions, as a jab at hypocritical Buddhist monks. Certainly, Nurarihyun sums up what has always been generally true about Johns. Men who purchase women are powerful, yet leechers, often considerably older, and slime.